Sheep brain has a lot of the same structures as a human brain, but it looks kind of smushed or kind of melted. It's about a third or maybe a quarter the size of ours. But they're easy to study because they're large enough to see the structures, and a lot bigger than a cat brain, which is only about the size of a walnut. We look at it like this. What we see is a clear division right down the middle here. And that clear division is what's called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is going to separate the left hemisphere from the right hemisphere. Longitudinal fissure is right there in the center, okay? So we've got left hemisphere of the brain, right hemisphere, longitudinal fissure separating it. And then down here, what we see is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is kind of a little brain that dangles off of the brain down here. It's about the size of a walnut. That's the cerebellum. Now I'm going to flip it over. And what we're going to see on the other side are a couple little sprouts here. They're kind of torn up here and here. You can see they're long and white. Those are the olfactory nerves. Olfactory nerves. They're pretty big in this sheep. That's what's responsible for the sheep's sense of smell. So they're pretty big in us, in humans. Our olfactory nerves are about the size of matchsticks. They think that we used to have much bigger olfactory nerves, but we don't need them anymore because we're not out hunting and gathering for our dinner. We're going to Kroger. So we've pretty much lost those olfactory bulbs. Our sense of smell is not anywhere near what it used to be. So those are olfactory bulbs. Now as we move down, what we see right here, and this is very difficult to see, in fact I might just cross it off your list, but because it's gone. This is supposed to be an X-shaped structure that's called the optic chiasma. It's right here, this white area, and it sits like that in your brain. And what it actually does, that optic chiasma, it's a cross. And we all know this. Left side of our brain, left hemisphere controls movements on the right side. Right hemisphere of the brain controls movements on the left side. At that optic chiasma, that X, is where decussation occurs, the crossing over. At that X is where that crossing over occurs. Coming off the optic chiasma, what we're supposed to see here are optic nerves. There should be one coming up here that would go to the eyeball, one coming off here that would go to the eyeball. I'm going to cross those off your list because we just can't, I can't even show them, they're not there. All right, so then we go down here. Look on the back side of that cerebellum. This is your brainstem. Your brainstem has 3 different parts and pieces. The midbrain, which we can't really see on here, and then we see the pons here and the medulla oblongata there, going down into the spinal cord. That's what this is, your spinal cord. So we've got a bump, and then the cord. That first bump is the pons. The next big bump is the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord. So once again, on the whole sheep brain, what we see is the longitudinal fissure separating left and right hemispheres. Cerebellum is this structure here. On the underside of the brain, you see the olfactory bulbs here. We see the optic chiasma, which is that white structure there. Pons, medulla oblongata, spinal cord. Now here, what I've done is I've cut the brain in half, right down through the longitudinal fissure. And we're going to look at this half of it. Looks like that. So what we're going to see is up here, this is all cerebrum. And then we're going to get to a point where we see this white area. I'm going to pinch it. This white area that I'm pinching here is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum holds the center of your brain together internally. If I would take these hemispheres and kind of pull this apart at the longitudinal fissure, we see some pia mater holding those together. It's just a little bit of a webbing. But we get to the point where we can't pull it apart anymore. That's because we've hit that corpus callosum. That holds that brain together internally like a core. So here's the corpus callosum here. Now, just underneath that, we see this kind of pocket. There's a pocket there. If I pull it apart, you can see it's real smooth in there. That's because cerebrospinal fluid has been flowing through that. It's like a little riverbed. This is called the lateral ventricle. So cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow from the lateral ventricle to this area, which is called the third ventricle, and then down to this area, which is called the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle sits between the cerebellum and the brainstem. Fourth ventricle is here. So you've got lateral ventricle, that's the big pocket. Third ventricle is just under that corpus callosum, this space. And then fourth ventricle is this track right here between the brainstem and the cerebellum here. And there's the inside of that cerebellum. See how it looks like maybe a cauliflower or something? They call that the arbor vitae. It means tree of life. It's really kind of pretty in there. All right, so I'm going to run through these structures again. On the whole brain, you need to find the longitudinal fissure.